Well, good morning to those on the West Coast. If you happen to be on the East Coast, I hope your afternoon's going well. And if you're joining us from all the way over in Europe, I hope you had a good day. My name is Scott Morrison. I'm CTO and Chief Architect of Layer 7 Technologies, and this is Identity and Security in the Age of Cloud. And I'm lucky enough to actually be co-presenting this with Steve Copeland, analyst from the 451 Group. Now, analysts are an interesting breed, and I talk to a lot of them in my business. And I must say, usually it's fairly symbiotic. I mean, I give and they give, and we both learn something from each other. The thing about Steve, though, is I always feel like it's a little imbalanced, and I'm actually getting more than I give out to him. Steve is probably one of the most cerebral of the analysts. I think he really understands the philosophy, where the technology is going, but also really tempers that with a good, solid practicality, an understanding of what really works in the data center, what really works when you put it in the hands of people like you and I. So I'm actually really glad that he's here today, because I was going through his notes, actually, and his slides, and I realized there's a tremendous amount of good material there. And I must say, even coming over here on the plane to do this webinar, I actually learned a tremendous amount, and I think you will too. So without any ado, I'd like to introduce you to Steve Copeland, who's somebody who is an analyst who I recommend tremendously, and I'm actually very happy to call a friend. And with that, take it away, Steve.
All right. Well, thanks, Scott, for that very kind and generous introduction. I appreciate it. Thank you for the opportunity as well. Just by way of introduction, we're discussing enterprise security and cloud computing this morning. I am a senior analyst within the 451 Group's enterprise security practice. We are an independent industry analyst firm, been around for close on 11 years now. We focus on emerging technologies, understanding the impact of emerging technologies. We've certainly been looking at cloud for quite some time. It was a natural outgrowth of our coverage of grid computing and virtualization. Scott was remarking in the just before we started the webinar that we have offices in Santa Fe. We have a sister research organization called the Uptime Institute, another which focuses on management of data center facilities. We have another sister research organization called Tier 1 that looks at the business of data centers, and we're increasingly collaborating with our colleagues in Tier 1 around cloud-based services. And just recently, we have acquired the InfoPro, which is around the corner from our offices in New York. Great bunch of people, and looking forward to collaborating with them more. So just to go over the agenda, in any webinar that discusses or presentation discusses cloud, we're going to have to start with the definition. It's our own definition that we developed over the years through our Cloud Codex service. I'm just going to briefly touch on what control and security issues does cloud present. How do these issues map to how we currently do security, and why this creates the need for cloud access governance. What role does identity play in cloud access governance? And then understanding kind of next steps from the existing set of cloud access governance and identity in the cloud technologies to making the transition to distributed access management. So again, kind of just defining, setting the baseline here for what we mean by cloud computing, and how we understand cloud as an IT operating model, and IT functionality consumption mode. And again, kind of, where security fits into it. So over the past 2 years or so, we've tried to maintain a consistent definition of what constitutes cloud and cloud computing. And this slide represents our latest cuts as what we see as the defining elements of cloud and the constituent technologies. So we have technology enablers, and then we have the kind of common fabric of cloud and common kind of characteristics, multi-tenancy, automation, virtualization, scalability, and elasticity. So the first point to make is that we see cloud in terms of horizontal and vertical dimensions. So the horizontal is ranges from the public cloud to the private cloud, or what could be understood as dedicated, where enterprise organizations would address some of the custody issues that are foremost in their mind around data security, and will give up some of the operational flexibility and cost advantages of the cloud to mitigate some of those security concerns. So the horizontal access is the very familiar categories of SaaS, PaaS, and IaaS. And just recently, we've added to our cloud codex the notion of software infrastructure as a service. And software infrastructure as a service includes management and security software delivered as a service. So software infrastructure as a service is different from SaaS in that the applications are not enterprise applications, but instead are focused on managing, monitoring, and securing the IT infrastructure. So when we look at this diagram, I think it's also useful to make the distinction between security for the cloud, security in the cloud, and security by the cloud, or from the cloud, as others might phrase it. So extending internal logic to govern and secure access to off-premise resources, we define security as security for the cloud. So security for the cloud can also be understood as a bridge or federation, more technically speaking, between on-premise and off-premise infrastructure. And typically we are talking about SaaS here, putting aside for a moment the debate on whether SaaS is truly cloud. But we also see security to the cloud as being an important element of securely facilitating the process of hybridization, or the kind of incremental transition towards cloud computing. So we understand security in the cloud as security controls for a shared elastic resource that's either running in a third-party environment or in a dedicated private cloud. And then security by the cloud or security from the cloud. A prime example here is authentication as a service, which is clearly growing in momentum. So as we look at this diagram, I think it's important to note there's one common factor across the spectrum and across the axes, and that's the user. So as we expand later, understanding who the user is in the context of the service, and the relationship between the service provider and the service consumer, both in terms of the business relationship, the contractual relationship, and to use a loaded word, the trust relationship between the service provider and service consumer, is all fundamental to understanding how the enterprise security policies and logic start to migrate to the cloud. So wrapping up that user identity allows for enterprise policies to be propagated across the cloud spectrum. But, and there's a big but, the policies and the attributes have to remain consistent, and when we move to the cloud, that context is much more dynamic. So I'm just going to bolt through this slide, since it talks to the maturity model that I'm going to bring up a little later. But the upshot here is that there are varying degrees of cloudiness, and at each stage there's a new set of demands on the infrastructure. So if we assess what the implications are for security, risk management, and access controls when we make the journey to the cloud, with hybridization obviously a major destination on the itinerary, it becomes immediately clear that there are far fewer elements of the infrastructure that are under the service consumer's direct control, even as the resources available to the organization have expanded, right? So there's there's less we can directly control. We being the enterprise or organization, and there's now more resources available to us. So what this implies is the service provider, whether they embrace this role, this task, enthusiastic or not, are now responsible for security to the extent, the level of the stack they inhabit. And secondly, that service consumers need to shift their focus towards the top layer of the stack, since they're effectively ceded control of infrastructure security. We had to kind of frame this in relatively simplistic terms. You can't buy an IPS for an Amazon Web Services EC2 instance, and now the service consumer has to rely on the service provider to ensure that there's back-end privilege containment, as well as demonstrate that effective controls and programmatic restrictions are in place in a multi-tenanted environment. And certainly we've seen some service providers move to provide some assurance that either HIPAA or PCI compliance measures and controls are in place. I mean, this is again a kind of touchy, sensitive subject, but certainly it illustrates a trend. So the third implication is that service consumers now have to rely on their internal policies a lot more and assume less of a network-centric approach, which clearly has kind of been the defining practice for enterprise security to a large extent. And obviously compliance rears its head here, and again, kind of we tend to make a clear distinction between compliance and security, but clearly there's an overlap. And the overlap is around the need to log, audit, and demonstrate the existence and the adequate enforcement of effective access controls. So the most obvious candidate here for the cornerstone of consistent set of policies for what's acceptable in the cloud across domains is identity. Identity is a logical starting point for the compliance process as well, since it serves as an organizing principle alongside a resource. So now it becomes clear if we kind of look at the implications that security is not about building high walls anymore and concentric layers of defense. It's about enforcing the appropriate set of conditions exist for a transaction within the context of a particular business process. And in many ways, too, it kind of exposes how much further we have to travel in terms of identity management capabilities. And in many cases, when we speak about identity, we're really talking about the corporate directory. And even more specifically, the policy logic that's encapsulated in Active Directory group memberships. And honestly speaking, a lot of the data transformations that happen for cloud security and access management happen outside of the traditional identity management sphere. Also we've seen the need for an independent and more intelligible event stream drive adoption of federated SSO and federated identity. So certainly we can make the argument that cloud changes how security is done, but in many ways it forces us to go back to first principles and assess how identity can serve as a stand-in for enterprise policies. So what does this have to do with identity and cloud? With first principles in mind, identity starts to assume more importance for two reasons. Firstly, it's an important building block in defining policies and who can touch what in the cloud and what set of actions they can take. Secondly, identity becomes an important construct in extending policies into a dynamic environment and allowing for increasing degrees of automation, right? Much activity we've seen in the area of identity in the cloud, like federated SSO to SaaS applications and authentication as a service, is driven as much by compliance as it is by security. So again, we see compliance as an outgrowth and separate outcome from security. There's no doubt that compliance is an important element here, but we think it's a kind of distraction from the broader challenges of cloud security. Because if we look at the history of the cloud, IT professionals initially wrestled with the question of what they can do in the cloud. We initially just saw kind of test and dev migrate to the cloud, and then when IT professionals looked to expand from that, they encountered security and compliance issues. And that kind of defined what they couldn't do in the cloud. So the question now posed by cloud computing and service enablement automation is what could an organization do in the cloud? How could the cloud help make business processes more efficient and seamlessly integrated? It's not simply about cost and operational flexibility. It's about using cloud in ways that improves operating practices. Could cloud bursting be used for a broader set of workloads? And in terms of enabling technology, the question is now broader than getting users or other identities like services or applications through the front door at the cloud service provider. It's what they can do once they've authenticated to an API, regardless of the authentication protocol. So this raises a set of related requirements how identity slots into the cloud architecture, right? Granularity, automation, and security again. Identity needs to slot into a cloud environment that's been architected to be automated, to be dynamic, with robust self-service capabilities that has kind of SLAs attached and allows for continuous monitoring. So identity in the cloud is important. I think we've kind of touched on a few reasons, but it's also important in terms when you look at the fundamentally the kind of topology and the architecture that's involved here. And identity becomes a kind of crucial element in managing continuous services across this continuous architecture. We can no longer make assumptions about the kind of topology that we could when we design data centers or on-premise infrastructure. Identities emerge as the most obvious logical construct to establish service continuity not only between the enterprise and a third-party application, but between and across cloud instances. We're seeing this in terms of OpenStack, for instance. And those cloud instances may be private, may be public, may be hybrid, or may even be a platform as a service or PaaS environment. Now that identity is portable, but still contingent on a enterprise identity or some authoritative store, the stage is set for converting enterprise user profiles into a set of assured attributes articulated in standards for dynamic, automated, and granular authorization and provisioning. So, kind of to bring things back to basics here, I think the requirements are still relatively straightforward. To authenticate users, then on the basis of authentication to propagate those identities out to third-party services, and increasingly to internal web apps and across multiple SaaS applications. And then finally manage those user accounts so that the attributes and status across those application silos remain consistent. It's how this is done to allow for automation and scalability that we're now kind of bumping up against. And there's certainly plenty of identity management standards out there that allow for integration of set of attributes into a cloud environment. And in fact, I think there's a valid argument that there are too many identity standards competing for attention there with overlapping scopes. So certainly, SAML is probably the most prevalent, but coverage is the issue, and we've certainly seen alternatives emerge. And I think also it's kind of important to note that these standards are for most part limited to getting an identity across the cloud threshold with a set of static attributes associated with it. Or in the case of OAuth, exposing an API using an open convention. But once identities traverse a cloud API, a whole new set of provisioning authorization questions present themselves, along with these requirements for granularity, automation, and policy-driven enforcement that we spoke about. So I think standards should be understood as the starting point for cloud identity, but I think we may be overstating matters when we define it as a panacea. So now we discussed the importance of identity. We need to turn to the infrastructure that allows identity to serve as a means of extending enterprise security policies. So some time ago, we introduced the term cloud access gateway and cloud access governance to describe the network entity that sits at the edge of the service consumer and the service provider, and operates the kind of the loose analogy that I use here is a web reverse proxy that establishes a perimeter between the enterprise network and the internet. The distinction here is that as the infrastructure becomes distributed, so too does the access gateway, right? So the gateway where the gateway resides is a reflection of the topology rather than the other way around. And the outcome here is a need for distributed access management. In other words, with the cloud there is no single edge, and the edge is dynamic. So we tend to think of the cloud access gateway as a foundational element for cloud access governance. So this cloud edge device provides some ability to manage bidirectional flows between on-premise and off-premise infrastructure, allows for enforcement of a consistent set of security and security policies and granular access policies across hybrid environments. So from a functional perspective, then this flow management would entail some ability to transpose internal logic onto external environments, such as a infrastructure as a service instance, or a virtualized session running on an external server. This functionality would also enable service providers to enforce rules on policies and traffic between the service consumer and the cloud while maintaining interoperability. So in order for identity to scale effectively and serve as a foundational construct for cloud security and automation, there needs to be some way to transparently, securely, and reliably communicate attributes of identity and, by extension, policies between a service provider and a service consumer. So certainly, SAML and XACML are the kind of protocols that present themselves here. The question is, what's the messaging, the messaging schema, etc. So the players that emerged to provide this cloud infrastructure element were designed to operate as service brokers as well as a policy enforcement point. They've also had to adapt to facilitate this dynamic edge, first through developing virtualized instances of the appliances and then starting into provisioning systems so they can spin up and down based on session requests. So these instances can either be pre-populated with policies or dynamically populated with policies as they spin up. They can be straightforward as all the authorized users for a particular resource. In this sense, they serve as much as a point of integration between enterprise access policies and the target application or service. This means that the cloud gateway can both propagate out enterprise identities to a service or allow for policy enforcement of an application or access controls to a data set that runs in AWS, just for instance. So is there a distinction between federated SSO and cloud access governance? We tend to think so. At the moment, though, there's pretty much a large overlap in terms of functionality, and we see the same set of standards being deployed in both contexts. I think the obvious distinction that we can make is that the cloud access gateway is a network element that principally provides policy enforcement, but that doesn't preclude it necessarily from serving as a policy decision point. Also, cloud access gateways can function as secure token services, or what's understood as an STS, taking an authenticated identity token and mapping it to a format that the relying party can consume. I think Federated SSO clearly provides it as well, but there's a difference in terms of the level of support and the scalability and performance. I think where the fundamental distinction lies, we think, is between Federated SSO and Unified Access Control serving as a means serves as a means of allowing the enterprise to act as an identity provider based on the corporate user store and then manage user accounts across multiple applications or resource-specific identity stores. The cloud access gateway, on the other hand, brokers a session between the service provider and service consumer, enforcing policy and maintaining continuity of the session. So let's take a kind of broader view of what the challenges are. Up until now, we've largely been talking of identity and access management based on attributes in the abstract. The reality clearly is far messier. Identity management is contending with a new set of requirements, and a meeting of minds with the cloud service providers and platform vendors is still largely a work in progress. The kind of flippant way that I describe it is identity management vendors are from Mars, and cloud service providers are from Venus. And because identity is still largely an unsolved problem, the identity management industry is still largely focused on internal architecture and internal exchange control protocol challenges as a precursor to launching into the cloud. So while the identity management community is hard at work defining a set of standardized exchange protocols, we see a philosophical distinction between how the cloud and identity world perceive portable identity. For cloud service providers, there's more interest in creating a portable image identity than defining attribute definitions and messaging exchange schemas. This is because cloud service providers are more interested in scale and automation, and certainly security as a result of how the market's evolved, than they are in how identities are managed. But there's no way that they can escape from identity, since it's the only way to resolve compliance, or at least the most obvious way at this point to resolve compliance, security, and service continuity issues. Cloud service providers need to consume identities. And I think what we're finding now is that not a few are looking to find ways of managing more efficiently in their own environments, which tends to kind of reinforce the rise of the directory in the cloud that we'll discuss later. So given all these dynamics, cloud access gateways offer something of a compromise here, facilitating integration of existing identity management and technologies within that cloud infrastructure. So we circle back to the question of enterprise security in the cloud and understand cloud access governance really as this kind of compromise between the states of identity management and the requirements of cloud service providers. We can start to plot something of a way forward or a maturity model. This is our best answer to the question of what we could do in the cloud, looking at security as an enabler rather than a hurdle to a shift in IT consumption models. So the first stage is where most of the activity is concentrated now, making enterprise access policies portable, using kind of standards-based methodology. The next stage is embedding those enterprise policies into cloud-based services, with cloud access gateways allowing for the policies to traverse clouds. The architecture stage that we outline here may be a distant point for many organizations, but we've certainly seen not a few enterprises and service providers building your services based on cloud computing technologies. And Netflix, I think, is one prime example here that comes to mind. For these service providers, identity is still an important element for service provisioning and incoming requests. But for others progressing along the path, moving out of, say, the managed service provider world, or the the hosted a hosted service provider, a server provider, it'll be important for moving services across clouds and pushing out outgoing services requests or workloads. So this is another take on the maturity model we mentioned. Obviously, the point of the maturity model is dependent on the degree to which an organization embraces cloud computing. I mean, on the one hand, you'll have organizations that have enormous legacy investments that aren't that need to be amortized, or that doesn't make sense to kind of port an application to the cloud. At the other extreme, you'll have organizations who say, "We'll never buy a physical server again." And I think it's also, to what degree do they consider managing access to the cloud in terms of the classic identity management paradigm, and historically how much they have invested in identity management infrastructure. So I think, stage one here is authentication to a third-party resource based on an enterprise identity. I think that's fairly well established trend, and we could even make the argument there's a kind of mature set of technologies around that. Authentication and SSO to multiple SaaS applications is stage two, along with access logging for compliance and operational provisioning. I think that's where a lot of the heat and light is right at this point, and we're certainly seeing any number of entrants, both new players and incumbents re-architecting, retooling to go after this set of requirements. Stage three is authorization and programmatic provisioning. I think that's a little further out, but definitely a lot more time and effort's been spent on that. Stage four is identity hub. I think we are seeing some of the larger platform and infrastructure players kind of thinking about how they develop services, who the appropriate partners are for an identity hub. Directory in the cloud is definitely gaining a lot of attention. And I think service embedded identity management, we're already seeing kind of Amazon Web Services move in this direction. I think there's plenty of activity at other cloud service provider aspirants. Verizon Business is one that's already looking at these questions, and certainly there's plenty on their heels. And ultimately, we get to the stage five, which is cloud identity, where the identity is resident in the cloud, where we have all these characteristics of granularity, automation, and security. So I think once organizations have advanced down the path of adopting SaaS and view cloud computing in strategic terms rather than opportunistically, how they see enterprise security policies encapsulated in identity management terms is gradually transformed. Likewise, the cloud services, cloud service and stack providers catering to these organizations must now figure out how cloud identity figures in their technology and strategy decisions. So if we think back to the distinctions we made between federated SSO and cloud access governance, and then overlay them onto the maturity model I've just outlined, it becomes clear that the two functionality sets are really complementary. Federated SSO and a secure token service at the edge of the network, or within a federation hub, as we increasingly see, allows for packaging of an identity based on enterprise logic. But as a number of clouds proliferate and the consumption models shift from a few SaaS applications to hybridization to living in the cloud access governance becomes more important. The identity and associated attributes can remain fairly consistent, albeit to some degree of variation in the attributes that are exposed to the service. We're looking at distributed access management at multiple cloud edges. So in the enterprise market for identity management, we hear a lot of these days about the need for identity analytics using the BI analogy, the business intelligence analogy. We think the kind of total data analogy our colleagues in our information governance practice come up is also kind of a useful analogy. I think, but ultimately what it amounts to is the realization that there's a whole sprawl of identity-related data silos that are distributed across the enterprise in repositories that aren't integrated or synchronized or normalized within the identity management infrastructure. So clearly it's a data management issue. And there needs to be some kind of mechanism for making sense of the outcome of the process of data management. So what's exciting about the cloud is that rather than try and stuff the outcome of the data management process into a repository that wasn't designed to serve as a policy store, the core identity construct, typically an AD set of credentials or profile that resides in an authoritative user store, can be used as a basis for directory in the cloud. So instead of creating more complexity within the enterprise in order to deal with the cloud, the directory in the cloud allows for that core identity construct to be enriched and stored in a purpose-built hierarchical data repository with rules on how the attribute set can be exposed to services. Certainly, we can think of a privacy service kind of hanging off that directory in the cloud, where you'd be able to delegate what attributes you will and won't expose to a service in a kind of very granular self-service fashion. So the point of integration to the cloud from this directory in the cloud and back into the enterprise would be the cloud access gateway that we've discussed. So the notion of the direction in the cloud is also gaining currency because of the integration and user account management problems generated by increasing and broader SaaS, IaaS, and PaaS usage. As soon as there are multiple accounts to be managed in resource-specific silos, essentially back to square one, right? And we're at the point where we're effectively creating a reason for the development of identity and access management as a kind of functionality set. We've seen a lot more time and effort at vendors to build structured account management capabilities and create synchronization process across user stores. But because the topology of the cloud and the relationship between the authoritative store and the target resource can't be hard-coded, dynamic and distributed access management, again, is an important factor here. Also, enterprise directories don't provide the kind of flexibility required to support a broad range in the categories of accounts, like ephemeral accounts that are really kind of associated with this particular project or collaboration portal, or an account that's as a time to live associated with a specific application, or business process like account validation or service enrollment that we certainly see becoming a big demand in the healthcare vertical. So just wrapping up, I think extending enterprise security to the cloud follows a kind of a set of fairly straightforward principles. Clearly, there's a lot of complexity under the covers, but I think if we start off with these principles, it serves as a productive foundation. So taking what you know about your users, pushing out what you want services to know about your users, looking beyond federated SSO to distributed access management, and making services identity aware for SaaS and PaaS stacks. And with that, I'll wrap it up and hand over to Scott.
Well, listen, that was great, Steve. Thank you very much. And well, everybody, as I promised, Steve digs deep and really cuts to, I think, the core of what we need to look at these days in the cloud. And I think if we go with this hypothesis, and I do genuinely believe it's true, that really this is a time where we can't just fall into the same constructs and essentially let our existing ideas, our existing design patterns, and moreover, our existing technologies drive how we do single sign-on, federation, identity in the cloud, and security in the cloud. And instead what we need to do is really look at the basic principles and look again at this whole concept and realize that identity is fundamental to all of these pieces that are sort of surrounding the cloud. And so once we really understand what the basics are, then we can step back and start to look at how we can begin to use our existing technologies, our existing protocols and ideas, whether it's things like SAML, whether it's newer ideas like OAuth coming out, and assemble these into a really cohesive identity infrastructure that really does extend out to the cloud. It isn't just this sort of simple bolt-on that you stick onto your existing identity and access management system, but instead is a much more holistic view, essentially, about how you approach the cloud and how you deal with this problem of compliance in the cloud and generalized security, really, which is fundamentally an outgrowth of that. So let's talk really quickly here, because we don't have too much more time, about some of the ideas that Steve's hit on, and I think some of the new kinds of technology, which are real outgrowths, real evolutions of mature technologies, but that have been recast, I think, against this whole idea of identity being the basis of the new security model in the cloud. So, of course, this is me, if any of you know me, taken out in my backyard a few years ago. Hopefully I look pretty much the same, and I haven't aged too much from, running around on airplanes and things like that too much. And, of course, I've got security tokens all over the place. I've got usernames, I've got passwords, I can generate SAML tokens and everything like that. Fundamentally, it's pretty easy to identify me and who I am. The bigger question, though, is what happens when I start to get lost in a much more wide diversity of identities? And how do we effectively take that wide diversity of identities and start to move it out into an area of the cloud where really the perimeters are extremely organic? They're moving, they're very dynamic, they're changing all the time. You can't just go out there and say, well, you know what, out in the cloud we're going to have a proxy identity for Scott Morrison, and he's going to be the CTO of Layer 7, so we'll let him get access to all this important stuff, associated with Layer 7 and all of that. Because here's the truth. I might get fired tomorrow. I might have done a terrible webinar or something, and so, the board comes to me and says, you know what, you're not it. And so I'm gone. And then all of a sudden you've got this terrible problem of having to go out and modify these records for Scott Morrison in all of these different cloud locations. And the truth is, many of them you may not actually have a lot of control over. One of the things that Steve talked about that really struck me was, the whole idea of the boundaries of control in the cloud, which move around quite a bit. And this is something that's interested me for quite a while, and I've actually wrote about it a little bit in my blog. If you look at different instantiations of the cloud, whether it's software as a service or infrastructure as a service or kind of the middle ground, platform as a service, the one that I actually think is going to be the most important in the future, they each give you different levels of control as a security administrator or as somebody, let's say, who's responsible for your overall cloud vision and cloud management strategy. SaaS, like software as a service, obviously doesn't give you too much. It really gives you the basics of identity, whereas something like infrastructure as a service gives you tremendously more capabilities simply because you can run virtualized images down there. So you really have to start to ask yourself then, what is the way we're going to actually deal with things like a diversity of people coming and going all the time? We don't necessarily want to be, hard coding essentially identity and access policies and that all over in the cloud, simply because those boundaries are constantly changing. And the clue really comes in some technology that's grown up over a number of years, this idea of security gateways, which are really a best practice certainly in the SOA world, but have a tremendous amount of relevance as well out in the cloud. And that's really what I want to use as a foundation of something we're going to talk about here, which is how to actually start to rebuild the security infrastructure, both on-premise but also in the cloud, that leverages what you've got. So in other words, this isn't a rip and replace or anything like this. What this is a true logical iterative extension that builds up on the investments you've made in identity, but really makes them more relevant somewhere in the cloud, which is obviously a much more dynamic area, a dynamic perimeter. Now, in a lot of cases, I show these cloud services gateways as these sort of physical instantiations, and in fact, that's truly where their roots are. But really, over the years, they've grown into a much more sophisticated beast, which is not just hardware, but also a virtual appliance, which means all of a sudden it can have tremendous application out in a cloud environment like infrastructure as a service. A great example might be Amazon's EC2, or the cloud that, let's say, Savvis is making available to people. These infrastructure as a service clouds actually can start to take devices like this, and they can add value in actually giving the enterprise the ability to actually start to manage all of its control and manage its policies. And moreover, to do that in such a way that you can begin to exchange policies between different devices, so that all of a sudden the devices are much more aware of where to get policies. They know where the authoritative source of policy is. So you don't end up with this situation of having to go out there and change access control rules in half a dozen different places simply because the CTO got canned last week. We should instead start to look at models where we can actually distribute where attributes and important characteristics of identity that don't change, such as, let's say, job title, CTO, don't change particularly, so that if the CTO comes and goes, if I'm gone next week and the next guy is in, and then maybe they hire Steve or something as my replacement, they don't actually have to go out to, all of the different cloud locations and make any change. If your access control rule is based on attributes of a job or attributes of a role or all the other information that constitutes identity, really, and very often that is not necessarily something hard like a name of somebody. It's more it's more of a collection of characteristics of who you are, what you're trying to get access to, the particular service, API, application, whatever that you're trying to get access to. So this kind of idea of runtime evaluation of what's going on and the nature of a request is really at the heart of this idea of creating a dynamic identity perimeter. Now, the other thing that Steve mentioned, which I think is very important in this whole thing, is the idea that these new cloud services gateways really bring together a lot of different functionality. This isn't just, your father's simple web application firewall or anything like that. It really is a conglomeration of a lot of different components, from policy management to audit, which of course are the foundations of any compliance strategy, but also to things like security token services, the ability to actually give out tokens, to map tokens and that, so that you can build up a real effective identity strategy. So all of this really is subsumed into one really highly functional device that can be deployed just about anywhere, not just in the classic DMZ sort of deployment that we've seen in the past, but actually out in clouds as well. And not just public clouds, but private clouds too. Because I think for the enterprise, the idea of the private cloud makes tremendous sense. Now, a lot of cloud pundits will argue, there's no such thing as a private cloud. It's just big virtualization. And to be honest, I couldn't disagree more. I think the idea of cloud is really bringing together a lot of different components of technologies and that. But it's also a philosophy about how to approach the management of resources effectively in IT. And it's a new approach that is much more about automation, much more about self-service, and much more about high utilization of existing technology and the leverage of commoditization. And that's something you can do anywhere. That's something you can do within your own, corporate environment or out in the public cloud. Those are the important characteristics, not necessarily that it's multi-tenant with different parties and different organizations in it. That's an interesting characteristic of public cloud, but it's certainly not a characteristic of all cloud. Yes, there will be multi-tenancy, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's public. A private cloud can have multi-tenancy within, let's say, a whole bunch of different departments, and you still have important compliance restrictions on those. HR information should never leak out, let's say, into finance. These are just fundamental points of corporate governance that we've lived with for many years. But cloud, whether public or private, should address these and create that effective isolation, between different areas. So the other point that Steve made when he was coming up through his talk was that really, in a lot of ways, security and as an outgrowth of that, compliance, of course, could really be broken up into a couple of different points. And that's security for the cloud, security in the cloud, and security by the cloud. which I think is very, very important. It's kind of third element that often gets lost in that whole discussion. And of course, this is something that we at Layer 7 have been working on for quite a while, looking at the whole problem of the cloud access gateway. And the first and most important component to that is getting out to the cloud. And we find this is the first thing that any enterprise hits, which is how do I do number one, simple things like single sign-on out to the cloud, so I don't have to start to replicate identities out into Salesforce or Google Docs or anything like that. And the other half of that, though, is the one that's often missed, is how do I let some of these more sophisticated platform as a service environments like VMforce or just Force.com or even Microsoft Azure or something like that, how do I allow them to call back into the enterprise and get access to my mission critical line of business applications? Because some of those aren't going to go out into the cloud soon. Some of those are running on mainframes that, quite frankly, are doing very well, thank you very much, and don't need to be moved out into the cloud. So how do we integrate those together? Like, how do we actually safely and securely let an authorized cloud identity actually get access back into, let's say, a core system of record like my mainframe booking engine or something like that, and do that in real time, and do that in a way that that MIPS on the mainframe aren't getting wasted by some trivial denial of service attack coming out over the internet. Those two functions, both the integration of data and the single sign-on out to the cloud, are really the functions of Cloud Connect, and that's a product, of course, that is available now. We've been selling it for a number of years. Now, in the cloud, of course, you have the problem of that isolation that I was talking about earlier on. And Layer 7's got a CloudSpan virtual gateway for dealing with exactly that. A lot of people are looking at the problem of isolation between tenants as simply a Layer 2, Layer 3 problem. And being Layer 7, of course, we beg to differ. We think Layer 2 and Layer 3 are very important parts of isolation. They always have been. But in fact, you have to look up the stack as well. And you have to look at the problem of how to effectively address identity, which, of course, at the lower ends of the stack isn't really addressed at all. And so one of the things that we look at is this idea of the virtual gateway being out there in the cloud in, let's say, an infrastructure as a service environment, providing really that management layer for access into your applications. And again, this could be a public cloud provider like a SaaS or an Amazon or a Rackspace or any one of these, all very, very important emerging players in this space that we'll hear a lot of over the next while. And of course, I think it's not just the cloud providers that can benefit from this, the public cloud providers. It's also the private cloud providers. And this may be something that you, in your own organization, will be doing a lot of work in. Because again, I think private cloud is a perfect first step into cloud for a lot of organizations. Now, finally, Steve talked a little about security by the cloud, which very often are things like authentication services and that. And what we're seeing at Layer 7 is a lot of need for automation, really, and orchestration of different components, especially in private clouds. And we have a product there called Cloud Control, which really is aimed at providers. So it's not necessarily for deployment, let's say, in a public cloud infrastructure as a service environment, or even a platform as a service environment, but it drives those. So in other words, it's a series of virtualized appliances that can actually be the basis of providing security and compliance and basically management into the basic APIs and services that run the cloud. So here's a good example. Let's say I've got an infrastructure as a service cloud. It's a private cloud that my organization is running. And I want to make available self-service interfaces so that my employees can actually start to spin up new images and make use of this wonderful new resource that I've created for them. I need a high level of authentication, authorization, security, audit on those interfaces. I need to be able to do threat detection to make sure that nobody's, attacking my, basic core infrastructure. Because quite frankly, I'm going to be pretty soon running some important mission-critical applications in there. This is what Cloud Control does. And moreover, it actually allows you to tie pieces together and orchestrate between the different components that make up the cloud. A good example of that might be in infrastructure as a service. If I'm a user of one of those APIs, I might want to bring up a new instance of an application server because my important new app is not quite keeping up with the load that's actually being thrown at it. So if I spin up a new instance of an app server, I don't just do that. Of course, I have to talk to, let's say, an F5 load balancer to, inform it that there's, yet another system that they have to actually incorporate into their load balancing regime. And of course, I may want to go into an audit database and say, at 12 noon on Tuesday, I actually spun up a new instance of this particular application. So all of these things require calls to other APIs. And so really what I'm doing is I'm aggregating fundamental calls to my infrastructure and putting them behind, let's say, a RESTful facade, a classic API that's secure, that's monitored, that actually has rate limits on it, that actually has very, very sophisticated abilities to exchange information about policy with other systems so that it's always consistent, and make that available to all of my different customers. And that's exactly what we do within Cloud Control. So quickly to sum up, really, I think what we've learned over this whole thing is that the thing about cloud is that the perimeters have become very dynamic and, in fact, are shrinking down. It's not just about creating castle walls anymore, but more creating, well, tanks, if you will. In other words, taking that hard shell, a hard perimeter, and shrinking it down to the level of an application or a service or an API and making it extremely mobile because it's going to move around a lot. It's an important characteristic of cloud. And the basis then of actually tying all of these, well, little tanks running around, if you will, to extend my metaphor maybe a little further than it should be, is identity, because you have to know who's talking to who, and really making that infrastructure coordinate effectively so that identity can be accepted effectively in a very, very dynamic field, a field that effectively is always changing. And doing that under a regime of compliance, that's really an important kind of next step in cloud. And that's really where Steve's concept of the cloud services gateway is actually really, really critical, because it is that critical piece of infrastructure that is going to be the basis of taking identity out into the cloud, out into the latter part of the 21st century. So with that, I'd like to thank everybody. It looks like we're right up on the edge of time right now, so I may not really have any time for specific questions, but if you do have questions, please, by all means, send them to me directly. My email is right here, smorrison@layer7tech.com. I will personally try to get in touch with you and back over email and answer your question. And I hope you can join me again for the next webinar that's coming up. I know one of my colleagues, Francois Lascelles, is doing one with HP, actually one of our partners, coming up in April, so keep an eye out for that. Thanks for your time, and I hope the rest of your day goes well. Goodbye.